The ceremonial execution ground of the Valkyrie Imperium was designed to make condemned prisoners feel appropriately insignificant before their deaths, which explained why Captain Jake Sullivan found himself standing in the center of a natural amphitheater carved from black volcanic stone while 1,000 alien warriors arranged themselves in perfect concentric circles around him. The acoustics were impressive. He could hear individual conversations from the back ranks, most of which seemed to involve betting pools on how many pieces he'd be chopped into. "I have to admire the production values," Sullivan muttered to himself, adjusting the restraints that bound his hands behind his back. When the Valkyrie decide to make a statement, they really commit to the theatrical elements. The warrior standing nearest to him, a 7-foot specimen of controlled violence whose armor bore the scars of approximately 50 different battles, tilted her head with what might have been amusement. Her pointed ears, longer and more elegantly curved than human ears, twitched slightly as she processed his comment. "You face death with humor, human," she observed, her accent turning the standard galactic words into something that sounded like controlled music. "This is unexpected. I've always believed that if you're going to die anyway, you might as well do it with style," Sullivan replied, looking around at the assembled army with the expression of someone reviewing architectural details rather than contemplating his imminent demise. "Though I have to ask, is the full military parade really necessary for one unarmed diplomat? I mean, I'm flattered, but this seems like overkill." The warrior's name, according to the briefing material Sullivan had studied during his 3 days in captivity, was war leader Thyra Bloodspear, commander of the 3rd Imperial Legion and heir to a military tradition that stretched back 8 centuries. She was also, if the intelligence reports were accurate, personally responsible for the conquest of 6 star systems and had never lost a single engagement. Her armor was a work of art that managed to be both functional and intimidating, all flowing curves and razor edges that complemented rather than concealed her athletic build. "The ceremony serves multiple purposes," Thyra explained with the patience of someone accustomed to educating the condemned. "It demonstrates imperial resolve to your people, provides closure for the families of Valkyrie warriors killed in border skirmishes, and ensures that your death carries the proper ritual significance." "Ritual significance," Sullivan repeated thoughtfully. "Right. Because apparently I've become some kind of symbol rather than just a guy who got lost trying to deliver a peace treaty." The truth was more complicated than that, though Sullivan saw no reason to explain the finer points of diplomatic immunity to someone who was about to remove his head with a sword. The negotiations on Kepler-7 had been proceeding reasonably well until some genius in the human delegation had suggested that the Valkyrie might consider resource-sharing arrangements for territory they'd considered sacred for 3,000 years. Cultural sensitivity, it turned out, was not humanity's strongest diplomatic skill. "You were not lost," Thyra corrected, her hand moving to rest on the pommel of her ceremonial blade. "You were trespassing on land claimed by blood and defended by honor. The penalty for such transgression is death, as your people were warned." To be fair, the warning was delivered in Old Valkyrie, which only about 12 humans in the entire galaxy can actually read. "But I suppose that's our problem, not yours." Thyra's expression shifted slightly, and Sullivan caught a glimpse of something that might have been surprise. "You speak as though you accept responsibility for the transgression." "I'm the head of the diplomatic mission. The buck stops with me, as we say in the trade." Sullivan shrugged as much as the restraints allowed. "Though I have to admit, death by ceremonial sword in front of 1,000 alien warriors wasn't exactly how I expected my career to end. I always figured it would be something more mundane, like paperwork-induced stress or accidentally insulting someone's mother at a state dinner." The amphitheater's acoustics carried his words to every warrior present, and Sullivan could hear the subtle shift in the crowd's murmur that suggested his attitude was not what they'd expected from a condemned human. The Valkyrie, he'd learned during his brief captivity, had very specific expectations about how enemies should behave in the face of death, most of which involved significantly more begging and considerably less commentary on the quality of their architecture. Thyra stepped closer, her movements graceful despite the weight of her armor. This close, Sullivan could see that her eyes were a startling shade of silver blue, and that they held an intelligence that the military briefings hadn't mentioned. Her ears, he noticed, were decorated with intricate silver jewelry that chimed softly when she moved. "Captain Sullivan," she said formally, her voice carrying easily through the amphitheater, "you stand accused of territorial violation, cultural desecration, and conspiracy to undermine imperial sovereignty. The penalty prescribed by law is death by blade, to be carried out immediately in the presence of the 3rd Legion. Do you wish to speak final words before sentence is executed?" Sullivan considered his options, which were essentially limited to die with dignity or die while making speeches. Given his background as a combat engineer who'd somehow ended up in the diplomatic corps, neither option held particular appeal. "Final words," he mused. "Right. Well, I suppose I should say something profound about the futility of war and the hope for peace between our peoples. But honestly, I think what I'll miss most is coffee. Real coffee, not the synthetic stuff they serve on long-range transports. There's this little cafe on Earth, in Prague, that serves coffee so good it could probably end wars if we could just get everyone to sit down and try it." The crowd's murmur grew more confused. Apparently, coffee appreciation wasn't standard final words material. Thyra drew her blade, a magnificently crafted weapon that seemed to capture and focus the amphitheater's lighting into patterns that danced along its edge. The motion was fluid, practiced, and utterly final. 1,000 Valkyrie warriors fell silent, their attention focused on the moment when their war leader would demonstrate imperial justice. "Any last requests?" she asked, raising the sword above her head in preparation for the downward stroke that would end Sullivan's diplomatic career along with everything else. "Just one," Sullivan said, looking directly into those silver-blue eyes. "Try the coffee sometime. If our species are going to keep killing each other, at least make sure you know what you're fighting about." Thyra paused, the blade motionless at the apex of its arc. Something flickered across her expression, surprise, curiosity, or perhaps recognition of something she hadn't expected to find in a condemned enemy. The silence stretched, becoming something more than mere anticipation. "Coffee," she repeated slowly, as if testing the word for hidden meanings. "Trust me, it's better than war." For a heartbeat that seemed to last forever, the amphitheater held its breath. 1,000 warriors waited for their leader to complete the ancient ritual, to demonstrate once again that the Valkyrie Imperium's justice was swift and absolute. Instead, Thyra Bloodspear did something that hadn't happened in the ceremonial execution ground for over 3 centuries. She lowered her sword. The immediate aftermath of what would later be recorded in Imperial military archives as the coffee incident involved approximately 30 seconds of absolute silence followed by the kind of chaos that occurs when 1,000 warriors simultaneously try to process something that violates every assumption they hold about reality. Sullivan, still bound and standing in the center of the amphitheater, found himself in the unique position of being more confused than anyone else present. "So," he said carefully, "does this mean the execution is postponed, or are we just taking a dramatic pause before the head-chopping part?" Thyra's second-in-command, an intimidating woman whose armor bore the distinctive markings of a veteran siege specialist, stepped forward with the expression of someone trying to maintain military discipline while her worldview crumbled around her. "War leader, the ancient protocols require." "I am aware of what the protocols require, Commander Kestra," Thyra interrupted, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who'd never had her decisions questioned in public. "I am also aware of what the kiss of claimed protection entails." "The what now?" Sullivan asked, then immediately wondered if questioning ancient alien legal procedures was wise when surrounded by 1,000 heavily armed warriors who looked increasingly bewildered. Kestra's expression suggested she was rapidly calculating the political implications of her leader's unprecedented decision. "War leader, that ritual hasn't been invoked in 3 centuries. The High Command will demand explanations." "Then they shall have them," Thyra replied, sheathing her ceremonial blade with decisive finality. "Captain Sullivan, you are hereby claimed under my personal protection according to the ancient rites of sanctuary. No warrior of the Imperium may harm you while you remain under my guardianship." Sullivan blinked. "I'm sorry, but could someone explain the part where kissing me apparently trumps the whole execution thing?" Because I'm pretty sure that wasn't covered in any of the diplomatic briefings. The explanation, delivered by a visibly uncomfortable Commander Kestra while Thyra arranged for Sullivan's transport to her personal fortress, involved enough ancient legal precedents to make a constitutional lawyer weep with joy. The kiss of claimed protection was apparently a remnant from the Valkyrie's tribal past, when individual warriors could claim sanctuary for refugees, prisoners, or anyone they deemed worthy of protection. The ritual required the protector to take personal responsibility for the protected's actions and survival, effectively making them legally inseparable under Valkyrie law. So you're saying that by kissing me in front of your army, she's essentially adopted me? Sullivan asked as the transport shuttle lifted off from the amphitheater. The legal terminology is more complex, Kestra replied with the tone of someone who'd rather be explaining battlefield tactics than ancient jurisprudence. But essentially, yes. Your life is now her responsibility, and any harm that comes to you reflects directly on her honor. Sullivan stared out the shuttle's viewport at the Valkyrie fortress below, a massive structure that looked like someone had decided to build a castle inside a mountain and then added enough defensive systems to repel small fleets. And she did this because I mentioned coffee? War leader Thyra's motivations are her own, Kestra said diplomatically, though her expression suggested she was asking herself the same question. The fortress's interior turned out to be a fascinating combination of ancient stone architecture and cutting-edge military technology. Thyra's personal quarters, where Sullivan found himself installed under what was technically protective custody but felt remarkably like house arrest, featured walls covered with what appeared to be tactical maps of 3-star systems and a collection of weapons that belonged in a museum. The accommodations are comfortable, Thyra said, entering the chamber with the fluid grace that seemed to characterize all her movements. She'd changed from ceremonial armor into simpler military dress that somehow made her seem more approachable without diminishing her obvious authority. You will find food, entertainment systems compatible with human physiology, and access to our communications networks. Very thoughtful, Sullivan replied, settling into a chair that had clearly been designed for someone with Thyra's build rather than his own. Though I have to ask, what exactly happens now? Do I just live here forever as your legal responsibility, or is there some kind of appeals process for mystical alien adoption rituals? Thyra's ears twitched in what Sullivan was learning to recognize as suppressed amusement. The protection bond can be dissolved in several ways. You may formally request release, though this would return you to your original legal status. I may choose to release you if circumstances warrant. Or. She paused, her expression becoming more serious, you may choose to accept permanent sanctuary and integrate into Valkyrie society. Integration involving what, exactly? Because I should mention that my combat skills are pretty much limited to run away and hide behind things. I'm not really warrior material. The Valkyrie honor many forms of service beyond warfare, Thyra said, settling into a chair across from him with movements that suggested this conversation had been planned. Your background includes combat engineering, infrastructure development, and diplomatic experience. These skills have value beyond their military applications. Sullivan studied her expression, looking for clues about motivations that had led to possibly the most impulsive political decision in recent Valkyrie history. War leader, can I ask you something? And please feel free to tell me it's none of my business. Speak. Why did you really save me? Because I have a hard time believing that my coffee appreciation speech was so moving that it inspired you to violate 3 centuries of legal precedent. Thyra was quiet for a long moment, her silver blue eyes focused on something beyond the chamber's windows. When she spoke, her voice carried undertones that suggested carefully controlled emotion. 6 months ago, my legion was ordered to pacify a human agricultural colony that had refused to abandon territory claimed by the Imperium. The colonists were civilians. Farmers, teachers, engineers like yourself. They had no military defenses, no weapons capable of threatening Imperial forces. She paused, her hands resting on the arms of her chair with enough tension to suggest the memory was not a comfortable one. The engagement lasted 3 hours. We achieved complete tactical victory with minimal casualties to our forces. The colonists surrendered immediately when they realized resistance was futile. And? Sullivan prompted gently. And I spent 3 hours watching people who posed no threat to anyone die because they happened to be standing on land that our map said belonged to us. Her ears flattened slightly against her skull. When you spoke of coffee and knowing what we fight for, you reminded me that we have forgotten to ask whether our fights are worth having. Sullivan felt several pieces of a complex puzzle clicking into place. So saving me was really about saving yourself? Perhaps. Or perhaps I have simply grown tired of being an instrument of policies I no longer understand. She looked directly at him, her expression challenging. Does my motivation matter to you, Captain? Only insofar as it affects my chances of surviving this with all my limbs attached, Sullivan replied honestly. Though I have to say, for someone having a crisis of conscience about imperial expansion, you picked a pretty dramatic way to express it. The dramatic gesture was necessary. Anything less would have been dismissed as temporary battlefield stress or political maneuvering. Thyra's smile was sharp-edged. Now the High Command must take my concerns seriously, because I have staked my personal honor on them. And if they decide your concerns are treasonous, then we will discover together whether your diplomatic skills extend to negotiating with people who want us both dead. Sullivan considered this, weighing the political implications against the growing certainty that his life had just become infinitely more complicated. War leader, I think this is the beginning of a very interesting partnership. Captain Sullivan, she replied, her smile becoming genuine for the first time since he'd met her, I believe you may be correct. The summons from the High Command arrived exactly 72 hours after what Sullivan had started mentally referring to as, the day I accidentally got adopted by an alien warrior princess. The message was delivered by a grim-faced courier whose armor bore the distinctive insignia of Imperial Internal Affairs, an organization that apparently specialized in making sure military officers maintained proper levels of patriotic enthusiasm. War leader Thyra Bloodspear, the courier announced with ceremonial formality, you are commanded to appear before the High Command Council in 3 days' time to answer questions regarding your recent invocation of ancient protection rights. You may bring the protected human as evidence. Evidence of what? Sullivan asked after the courier had departed with military precision. Evidence that my decision was militarily sound rather than personally motivated, Thyra replied, studying the formal summons with the expression of someone calculating tactical disadvantages. The High Command will want to determine whether my protection of you serves imperial interests or represents a betrayal of imperial values. Sullivan, who had spent the past 3 days learning to navigate Valkyrie fortress architecture without accidentally triggering security protocols, paused in his examination of what appeared to be a three-dimensional star chart. And what's the penalty for betraying imperial values? For ordinary officers, demotion and exile. For war leaders, trial by combat followed by execution if found guilty. Right. So, no pressure, but I might need to help you avoid death by sword fighting. Sullivan turned from the star chart to face her fully. Problem is, my combat experience is pretty much limited to that time I accidentally won a bar fight by falling down some stairs at exactly the right moment. Thyra's ears perked forward with interest. Explain this tactical maneuver. It wasn't tactical, it was accidental. 3 guys cornered me in a cantina on Proxima Station, I tried to back away, tripped over my own feet, and somehow managed to knock all 3 of them down the stairs when I fell. Pure luck. Thyra moved to a wall display that showed various combat scenarios in rotating holographic detail. Perhaps luck can be engineered. Tell me, what do you know of Valkyrie combat traditions? The crash course in alien martial arts that followed was both educational and mildly terrifying. Valkyrie combat, Sullivan discovered, was less about brute force and more about precise application of leverage, momentum, and what Thyra called environmental awareness. The philosophical foundation apparently involved working with natural forces rather than against them, which sounded elegant until you realized it meant learning to use everything around you as a potential weapon. The trial will require both individual and partnered combat, Thyra explained as she demonstrated a movement that involved using an opponent's momentum to redirect their attack. As my protected, you have the right to fight alongside me, but also the obligation to prove yourself worthy of protection. Define worthy in this context. Capable of contributing meaningfully to our mutual defense without becoming a liability. She handed him a practice sword that felt heavier than it looked. The good news is that the trial judges will not expect you to fight like a Valkyrie. The bad news is that they will expect you to fight like something. 3 days of intensive training revealed that Sullivan's coordination was adequate, his reflexes were reasonably quick, and his strategic thinking was unconventional enough to occasionally surprise Thyra. His actual sword work, however, remained what could charitably be described as enthusiastic amateur. I think I'm getting worse, he observed after a particularly unsuccessful attempt to execute a defensive parry that had somehow resulted in him accidentally disarming himself. You are overthinking the mechanical aspects, Thyra replied, retrieving his practice sword from where it had landed near the chamber's far wall. Combat is not engineering. You cannot calculate optimal solutions, you must respond to conditions as they develop. But I'm an engineer. Calculating optimal solutions is literally what I do for a living. And that, she said with a smile that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment, is exactly why you will succeed. Valkyrie combat doctrine assumes opponents who think like warriors. You think like someone who builds bridges instead of burning them. The trial itself took place in the High Command ceremonial arena, a massive circular chamber carved from obsidian and lit by floating energy spheres that cast dramatic shadows across the assembled judges. 5 war leaders in full ceremonial armor sat in judgment, their expressions suggesting they'd already reached conclusions that did not favor the defendants. War leader Thyra, announced the senior judge, a stern woman whose scars suggested decades of successful violence, you stand accused of placing personal sentiment above imperial duty. Your protection of this human undermines our military credibility and suggests corruption of your judgment by enemy influence. I stand ready to defend both my honor and my decisions, Thyra replied formally. And I stand ready to help, Sullivan added, then immediately wondered if defendants were supposed to speak without permission. The judge's expression suggested that defendants were definitely not supposed to speak without permission, but that his breach of protocol was less important than the entertainment value of watching him die horribly in the upcoming combat trial. The trial will consist of 3 challenges, the judge continued. Individual combat for each defendant, partnered combat against multiple opponents, and tactical demonstration of coordinated defense. Victory in all 3 challenges will vindicate your decisions. Failure in any challenge will result in immediate execution. All 3 challenges, Sullivan repeated quietly. No partial credit for effort. Valkyrie justice does not recognize moral victories, Thyra murmured back. The individual combat rounds proceeded exactly as Sullivan had feared. Thyra's opponent was a massive warrior whose fighting style resembled controlled violence performed by someone who'd studied destruction as an art form. Thyra, however, moved like liquid lightning, turning her opponent's size and aggression against him until his own momentum sent him crashing into the arena's barriers. Sullivan's opponent was smaller but faster, a veteran fighter whose attacks came in precisely coordinated combinations that should have overwhelmed an amateur. But amateur, Sullivan realized, might actually be an advantage. Where a trained warrior would have tried to counter each attack according to established doctrine, Sullivan simply did whatever seemed least likely to get him killed in the next 3 seconds. This is not how humans usually fight, his opponent observed during a brief pause when they'd somehow ended up facing each other from opposite sides of the arena. I'm not fighting like a human, Sullivan replied, breathing hard but still upright. I'm fighting like an engineer with a sword. What does that mean? I have no idea, but it seems to be working. The final exchange involved Sullivan remembering Thyra's lessons about using momentum and environmental factors. When his opponent charged for what should have been a finishing blow, Sullivan stepped aside at the last possible moment and used his sword's pommel to redirect the warrior's momentum toward the arena wall. The impact was spectacular and definitive. Victory to the defendants in individual combat, the senior judge announced with obvious reluctance. The partnered combat round was where Thyra's training began to pay dividends. Fighting alongside her, Sullivan discovered that his unconventional approach complemented her classical technique in ways that confused their opponents more than it confused them. While Thyra engaged enemies with traditional Valkyrie precision, Sullivan provided unpredictable support that kept their opponents from establishing effective attack patterns. He fights like someone who learned combat from machinery manuals, one of their opponents complained after a particularly confusing exchange. "Thank you," Sullivan called back. "I'll take that as a compliment." The tactical demonstration was the ultimate test, a scenario where they had to defend a position against overwhelming odds using only the resources available in the arena. This was where Sullivan's engineering background proved invaluable. While Thyra coordinated their direct combat response, Sullivan jury-rigged defensive systems from the arena's lighting and ventilation infrastructure, creating obstacles and traps that channeled their attackers into disadvantageous positions. "Victory to the defendants," the senior judge announced with unmistakable disappointment. "War leader Thyra, your protection of the human Sullivan has been validated by trial. Your judgment is deemed sound and your honor intact." As they stood together in the center of the arena, both breathing hard but victorious, Sullivan realized that something fundamental had changed between them during the trial. They were no longer protector and protected, they were partners. "So what happens now?" he asked as the formal ceremonies concluded around them. "Now," Thyra replied, her smile carrying implications that extended far beyond legal vindication, "we discover what it means to build something together instead of just defending it." The future, Sullivan reflected, was about to become very interesting indeed. Victory in the trial, Sullivan discovered, came with complications that the ancient Valkyrie legal codes had apparently not anticipated. Chief among these was the fact that proving his worthiness to be protected had somehow transformed him from a diplomatic prisoner into what the High Command termed, an irregular asset requiring classification. The classification process involved enough bureaucratic complexity to make human government agencies weep with envy. "So let me understand this," Sullivan said, reviewing the holographic documents that comprised his new legal status within the Imperium. "I'm simultaneously a protected person, a proven warrior, a diplomatic representative, and a cultural consultant. The legal terminology is necessarily complex," explained Commander Kestra, who had been assigned the apparently thankless task of translating imperial bureaucracy into concepts a human engineer could comprehend. "Your situation has no precedent in military law." "What she means," Thyra added with barely concealed amusement, "is that the High Command has no idea what to do with you, so they've created enough contradictory classifications to ensure that whatever you do next, they can claim it was their plan all along." The solution to the bureaucratic puzzle came from an unexpected source, Sullivan himself, during a strategy session that had devolved into increasingly creative suggestions for how to resolve the political implications of their partnership. "What if we stop trying to fit this situation into existing frameworks," he suggested, "and instead create a new framework that actually makes sense?" The proposal he outlined over the following week was radical enough to require approval from the Imperial Council itself. Rather than attempting to integrate one human into Valkyrie military structure, or negotiating his release back to human space, Sullivan proposed the establishment of a joint colony that would serve as a testing ground for human-Valkyrie cooperation. A cultural exchange initiative, he explained to the assembled High Command during what was officially a routine briefing but felt remarkably like defending a doctoral thesis. "Both species have strengths that complement each other's weaknesses. Humans excel at infrastructure engineering and resource optimization. Valkyrie are superior at environmental adaptation and defensive strategy. A cooperative colony could demonstrate the practical benefits of alliance rather than conquest." The senior judge from his trial, war leader Kara Ironwind, leaned forward with the expression of someone who'd found an unexpected intellectual challenge. "You propose to resolve interstellar political tensions through a construction project?" "I propose to resolve them through proof of concept," Sullivan corrected. "Right now, both sides are operating on assumptions about each other's capabilities and intentions. A joint colony would provide empirical data about what cooperation can accomplish. The debate that followed involved enough military, political, and economic analysis to occupy the high command for 3 days. Sullivan found himself in the unprecedented position of being a human engineer arguing military strategy with alien war leaders, most of whom had more combat experience than he had years of life. The logistics alone would be staggering, argued war leader Voss Battlehart, a pragmatist whose reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by her skepticism of untested strategies. Coordinating supply lines between species with different atmospheric requirements, different dietary needs, different social structures. Different but complementary, Thyra interjected. Captain Sullivan's analysis demonstrates that our species' differences create opportunities for symbiotic development rather than competitive conflict. The final decision came down to a vote that was closer than anyone had expected. The proposal for establishing New Harmony Colony passed by a margin of 1, with the condition that Thyra would command the Valkyrie contingent while Sullivan served as chief engineering coordinator and diplomatic liaison. "Congratulations," Commander Kestra told them after the official announcement. "You've just volunteered to attempt something that will either revolutionize interstellar relations or become the most expensive failure in recent military history." "Those aren't mutually exclusive outcomes," Sullivan observed. "Most revolutions start as expensive failures." The preparation phase for the colony project revealed just how complex their undertaking would be. Human volunteers for the expedition included engineers, agricultural specialists, teachers, and medical personnel, basically everyone needed to build a sustainable civilian settlement. The Valkyrie contingent consisted of warriors, environmental specialists, defensive coordinators, and what could only be described as cultural preservation experts. "We're essentially creating a society from scratch," Sullivan realized during one particularly intense planning session. "With 2 completely different sets of assumptions about how societies should function." 3 sets, Thyra corrected. "Human assumptions, Valkyrie assumptions, and whatever emerges from combining them." The colony site itself was a pristine world in neutral space, unclaimed by either species and possessed of the kind of natural beauty that made diplomatic compromises seem achievable. Rolling hills covered with native vegetation that resembled a cross between Earth forests and Valkyrie garden cities, clean water sources, defensive terrain that satisfied military requirements, and enough mineral resources to support long-term development. The first 6 months of New Harmony Colony were a masterpiece of organized chaos punctuated by breakthrough moments of genuine cooperation. Human engineering precision combined with Valkyrie environmental harmony produced infrastructure that was both efficient and beautiful. Valkyrie combat expertise merged with human tactical flexibility created defensive systems that could repel invasion while remaining unobtrusive enough not to intimidate visitors. "The agricultural integration is exceeding all projections," reported Dr. Lisa Park, the colony's chief agricultural specialist, during one of their monthly progress reviews. "The Valkyrie symbiotic growing techniques have increased our crop yields by 40%, while human soil optimization has accelerated their traditional cultivation cycles by 3 weeks." Sullivan looked across the conference table at Thyra, who was reviewing defensive patrol reports with the focused attention she brought to all military matters. 6 months of working together had transformed their partnership from protective necessity into something that resembled actual friendship, though Sullivan was increasingly aware that his feelings were becoming more complicated than friendship typically involved. "The cultural exchange programs are also showing positive results," added Elena Vasquez, their social coordination specialist. "We've had no major interpersonal conflicts, 3 successful joint celebration events, and 2 human Valkyrie couples who've requested formal relationship recognition." "Relationship recognition?" Sullivan asked, suddenly feeling like the conversation had veered into territory he wasn't prepared to navigate. "Marriage," Thyra explained matter-of-factly. "Or the Valkyrie equivalent, which involves considerably more sword work but similar legal implications." The success of New Harmony Colony was drawing attention from both human and Valkyrie governments, most of it positive but some of it decidedly skeptical. Political delegations from both species had begun scheduling visits to assess whether the cooperative model could be scaled up to larger diplomatic initiatives. "The Imperial Council wants a formal report on long-term viability," Thyra told Sullivan during one of their evening walks through the colony's central gardens. And the Human Colonial Authority is sending their own assessment team next month. So we're basically on trial again, Sullivan observed, except this time it's our entire way of life instead of just our personal decisions. Does that concern you? Sullivan considered the question, looking out over the settlement they'd built together. Human architectural efficiency blended seamlessly with Valkyrie environmental harmony, creating something that belonged fully to neither culture while honoring both. Children from both species played together in the central plaza, their laughter mixing with the gentle chiming of Valkyrie wind sculptures and the familiar hum of human atmospheric processors. A year ago, I was a diplomat whose biggest accomplishment was successfully negotiating a trade agreement for synthetic coffee substitutes, he said. Now I'm helping run an experimental colony that might reshape interstellar relations. I'm either living proof that the universe has a sense of humor, or I've stumbled into the most important work of my life. Perhaps both, Thyra suggested, her ear jewelry chiming softly in the evening breeze. Important work often requires people willing to attempt the impossible. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached the colony's highest point, a hill that offered panoramic views of everything they'd built. The settlement lights created patterns that suggested both human grid efficiency and Valkyrie organic flow, a visual metaphor for everything their partnership had accomplished. Jake, Thyra said quietly, using his given name in a way that suggested the conversation was about to become personal, there is something we should discuss. If it's about the new atmospheric recycling system, I promise the efficiency improvements won't interfere with your environmental harmony requirements. It is not about atmospheric systems. She turned to face him fully, her expression serious but not troubled. It is about us. Sullivan felt his heart rate increase in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Us. 6 months ago, I claimed your protection because your execution would have been meaningless violence that served no worthy purpose. But that is no longer why I value your presence in my life. The implications of her statement hung in the air between them like a bridge neither of them had planned to cross but both of them wanted to explore. Thyra, Sullivan said carefully, are you saying what I think you're saying? I am saying that you have become essential to me in ways that extend far beyond legal obligation or military partnership. Her silver-blue eyes held his gaze steadily. I am saying that I love you, Jake Sullivan, and I believe you love me as well. The kiss that followed was nothing like the dramatic public gesture that had saved his life 6 months earlier. This was private, gentle, and full of certainties they'd both been too cautious to voice until now. So, Sullivan said when they finally separated, does this mean I need to learn even more Valkyrie customs, or do we get to make up our own as we go along? We make up our own, Thyra replied with a smile that could have powered the colony's energy systems. That seems to be what we do best. 1 year later, their wedding ceremony took place in the colony's central plaza, conducted according to traditions from both cultures and several they'd invented specifically for the occasion. The guest list included representatives from 6 different species, 3 governments, and approximately half the population of New Harmony Colony. Do you, Jake Sullivan, asked the officiant, a Valkyrie priest who'd spent considerable time learning human ceremonial customs, take Thyra Bloodspear as your partner in all endeavors, your ally in all challenges, and your companion for all the adventures yet to come? I do, Sullivan replied, looking at the woman who'd saved his life by choosing love over duty, and who continued to save it every day by choosing partnership over everything else the universe offered. And do you, Thyra Bloodspear, take Jake Sullivan as your equal in all decisions, your partner in all dreams, and your heart's choice above all other possibilities? I do, she answered, her voice carrying the same absolute certainty she brought to military commands and engineering problems. As they exchanged rings, one traditional human design, one crafted according to Valkyrie techniques that incorporated living crystal, Sullivan reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them here. A diplomatic mission gone wrong had become a love story that proved cooperation could triumph over conflict, understanding could bridge any cultural gap, and sometimes the most important revolutions began with the decision to save one person's life. The celebration that followed involved enough food, music, and carefully choreographed cultural exchange to keep the colony's social coordinators busy for weeks. But Sullivan's favorite moment came near the end of the evening, when he and Thyra stood together watching their friends and colleagues, human and Valkyrie, civilian and military, idealists and pragmatists, dancing to music that combined elements from both their worlds. "Any regrets?" Thyra asked, her hand warm in his. "Only one," Sullivan replied. "I wish we'd met under circumstances that didn't involve quite so much mortal peril. Where would be the adventure in that?" Sullivan laughed, pulling her closer as the music swirled around them and the lights of New Harmony Colony twinkled like earthbound stars. "Good point. Though next time, could we maybe have our life-changing moments over coffee instead of ceremonial executions?" "I will consider it," she promised, her smile suggesting that their adventures were just beginning. The future stretched ahead of them, full of possibilities neither of their species had imagined alone, built on the foundation of one simple truth: sometimes the most profound changes begin with the choice to see enemies as potential friends, differences as opportunities, and love as the strongest force in any universe.